Recording is okay. So officially and formally welcome everyone. My name is Michelle Clifton Soderstrom and I serve as the Dean of Faculty at North Park Theological Seminary. And I am so delighted to see all of you at our first public theology lecture this year. Our overall series is we've decided as a faculty to focus on an ethic of belonging, building people toward each other, shared habitation, and ultimately communion. And what we do in these lecture series, we have 3 throughout the year, is we have our fields come up with topics and interact and interface with covenant pastors who are doing great work. And we want to do this in order to reimagine what it means to be a communion of belonging, specifically this year through the lens of culture. So today's event is entitled Purposeful Narrative, Engaging the Mosaic of Covenant History. And the context for the discussion today is the sixfold test for multi-ethnic ministry. For those who don't know, the sixfold was originally developed in 2004 as a test for covenant churches and ministries to think more structurally and mechanically about diversity and multi-ethnicity. And now it has moved to be taken up by affiliates such as North Park Seminary and North Park University as a rubric for diversity, equity, and inclusion work in a Christian context. The 6 Ps are population, power, participation, pace setting, purposeful narrative, and practicing solidarity. And today what we're going to focus on is the 5th P, which is purposeful narrative. And I'm excited to introduce our amazing group of panelists, beginning with Reverend Mary Chung March, who is the chair of the Mosaic Commission as a whole. And she's also the president of CAPA, which is the Covenant Asian Pastors Association. Welcome, Mary. We also have Reverend Bryan Murphy, who is the president of the African American Ministers Association, and he is also a North Park adjunct faculty. Welcome, Bryan. Next, we have Reverend Juana Nesta, who is the president of the Asociación Latina de la Iglesia del Pacto Evangelico. Welcome, Pastora Juana. Reverend TJ Smith is the president of the Indigenous Ministers Association. Welcome, TJ. And finally, we have Dr. Hauna Ondrey, who is associate professor of church history. And Dr. Ondrey is going to start us off.
Unmute myself. Okay. Thank you so much, Michelle. And I want to add my thanks as well to our panelists from the Mosaic Commission and to each of you joining this event. And also to give a special shout out to my Covenant History students who are here with us. I also want to express my gratitude for all of the prior and current Covenant historians, archivists, and Covenanters who have contributed to our collective historical narrative through writing, record keeping, and oral history sharing, making today's conversation possible. It's my hope in our sharing some of the rich denominational history that we steward to inspire and invite everyone here to become active participants in the work of history keeping. So I'm going to start us off by setting some broad context for today's conversation by offering a sketch, really rough sketch, of the key demographic turning points across covenant history. Thumbs up? Okay. So I often see the covenant described in shorthand as a denomination formed by Swedish immigrants that is now multi-ethnic. But it's important for us to recognize that the church didn't simply jump directly from the first to the second. Instead, between its origin and its present, multiple transitions have taken place, each made possible by the prior. So I'm going to give a flyover of 4 primary stages of demographic transition, beginning with the Swedish immigrant beginning in early life of the church, moving into the generational and linguistic transition from Swedish to English, followed by an enabling, thirdly, post-war expansion beyond Swedish American composition. And then finally, paying attention to the more intentional church planting and adoption strategies over the 1980s and 1990s, moving the denomination toward its current Mosaic composition. Approximately 1.3 million Swedes participated in the mass migration across a 90-year period between 1840 and 1930, almost half arriving in only 14 years between 1879 and 1893. All told, Sweden lost about 20% of its total population to the migration. The majority of Swedish immigrants didn't join any denomination, taking advantage of a new reality of religious freedom. However, in 1885, a very small subset of this larger community gathered in Chicago, the center of Swedish America, and formed Svenska Evangeliska Missionsförbundet I Amerika, the Swedish Evangelical Mission Covenant of America, in America, importantly. So as indicated by this name, the identity of the early covenant was as foreigners in a foreign land, Swedish Evangelical Mission Covenant in America. Swedish was the language of their common life, their worship, communication, publications, and denominational and congregational business. The early home mission was driven by the particular needs of their struggling immigrant community, including, for example, ministering to Swedes entering the US through New York and Boston harbors, and caring for orphaned children and the sick, acute needs in light of high mortality rates within the larger Swedish American community. The history of Indigenous Covenanters goes back to this period as well, when Alaska became the first international mission field of the US Covenant in 1889, 23 years before it became an official US territory, and 7 years before its statehood in 1959. The Covenant mission in Alaska was very small, and Indigenous evangelists and missionaries were part of the mission from the beginning, some imaged here, including Wilson and Minnie Ganungnan, commissioned as the first Native Alaskan church planters. Over the decades of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, the Covenant's original ethnic boundary disintegrated, driven by declining numbers of newly arriving Swedish immigrants in the early 20th century, by the distinct needs of a growing second generation that was beginning to slip away, and by restrictions on non-English languages imposed during the First World War, which pushed bilingual pastors into more prominent positions of leadership. Some key indicators of this transition include the first annual meeting conducted fully in English in 1929, the election of the first American-born, fully bilingual president, T.W. Anderson, in 1933, and in 1936, a change in the denominational name, removing the qualifier Swedish and replacing in America with of America. This generational linguistic transition was long, uneven, and difficult. It wasn't the expansion of the community beyond its original ethnic composition, but instead an identificational shift from a self-consciously immigrant group to a self-identified American denomination. This identificational shift and the elimination of the language barrier in turn furnished the practical conditions that enabled the expansion beyond Swedish ethnicity in the post-war period. This took place in no small part through suburban growth and suburban church growth as correspondingly. As congregations moved out of historically Swedish urban neighborhoods, they became community churches, attracting people with no historical tie to the denomination or any Scandinavian heritage. Given the racist lending and development policies underlying the creation of segregated suburbs and reinforced in turn by them, this expansion took place predominantly among white Americans. At the same time, this era also marks the beginning of the Covenant's expansion beyond a European American composition within the contiguous United States. The first Latino Covenant Church began in 1946 in Livia, Texas. Aside from this one instance, Latino, African American, and first-generation Korean American covenant congregations traced their roots to the 1960s and 1970s. This period of expansion took place through church adoptions, for example, Grace Covenant Church in Compton, planted by Robert Dawson, through racial transitions of historically Swedish American congregations, mirroring racially changing neighborhoods, as Black Americans moved into northern cities in the Great Migration and white flight took hold, for example, Oakdale Covenant Church. And also through parallel Latino congregations by and within established congregations, for example, Iglesia del Pacto Evangelico Douglas Park. By 1979, the covenant included 1 Estonian, 1 Assyrian, 4 African American, 5 Korean, and 8 Spanish-speaking congregations, together comprising 3.5% of the covenant's 544 member congregations. That same year, a resolution on diversity was adopted at the covenant annual meeting. It affirmed both the covenant's Swedish roots and its growing diversity. And it resolved to make a conscious effort no longer to assume Swedish American culture to be the norm for the covenant, and to reflect that pluralism in all that is done at the annual meeting. 30 years later, at the covenant's 125th anniversary in 2010, the proportion of covenant congregations classified as ethnic or multi-ethnic had jumped from 3.5% to 20%. This was largely the result of intentional church planting and adoption strategies of the intervening decades, spearheaded by the Department of Church Growth and Evangelism, in response to an increasingly multi-ethnic North American context. This numerical growth had structural and missional outcomes. New efforts were made to resource new linguistic communities. For example, simulcasting at the annual meeting in Spanish, and publishing Korean and Spanish translations of the covenant affirmations and other publications. From 1980, conversations began regarding culturally and linguistically appropriate pastoral training, the most significant result being the founding of Chet in 1989. The 1980s and 1990s also saw a formalization of structural mechanisms for organization and representation, including the formation of Korean, Hispanic, and African American ministerial associations. The Commission on Urban and Ethnic Ministries, the predecessor to today's Mosaic Commission, originated in 1980, and in 1995 divided into distinct commissions, urban ministries and ethnic ministries. In 1993, a constitutional amendment expanded covenant administrative boards to ensure representation from Black, Latino, Korean, and Native Alaskan covenanters. In the late 1990s, church planting and adoption strategies began to shift from a focus on ethnic-specific to multi-ethnic congregations. Some early examples are Henry Greenidge and Robert Owen's multi-ethnic church plants in Portland and Atlanta, respectively. Also critical for the growth of multi-ethnic congregations were second-generation Korean and Pan-Asian church adoptions and plants, beginning in 1997 with the adoption of Parkwood Covenant Church, established in 1995 by Peter Cha and Greg Yee, and followed by many others, especially after the turn of the century. In 1999, a 2-year denominational emphasis began on celebrating our ethnic diversity. And it was in this context that the first Covenant Sankofa journey was taken. The adoption of the fivefold test in 2004 represents both a culmination of prior emphases and a catalyst for continued movement. The goal of the test was to move past ethnic diversity as a matter of numbers only, i.e. the first P of population, and to ensure true diversity in the very fabric of the denomination as such, through attention to participation, power, pace setting, and purposeful narrative. More recently, 15 years after the original fivefold test, it was expanded through the addition of a sixth P, practicing solidarity. So as advertised, this has just been a really quick sketch, and so necessarily eliding countless individuals, congregations, initiatives, pains, and joys. But I hope it's provided helpful framework for contextualizing our panel conversation today. I want to underscore, in conclusion, that the Covenant's current diversity, both real and aspirational, is the product of a long, complex history of prior transitions, each building on the foundations of previous generations. And that we enter this needed conversation because of the many individuals and communities who precede us in it. So with that, I want to open up that conversation by inviting each of the Mosaic Commission members, our panelists, to first describe community that your ministerial association gathers, and to share with us a little bit about how your community's history is interwoven into the history of the denomination as a whole. What points of belonging and barriers to belonging has your community experienced historically as covenanters? So I'll pass it off now to Reverend March to begin.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hauna. And I just want to thank the team that put this together for this invitation and the insight, the wisdom to create such a space to talk about the ethic of belonging, being family together, and what it means to live out our theology together as family. So I just want to highlight, thank, applaud how North Park Theological Seminary has really incorporated and lived into the sixfold test. So thank you. In terms of CAPA, Covenant Asian Pastors Association, we are a group of Asian North American clergy, ministers, lay leaders, and the association serves as a place of fellowship, mentoring, leadership development for our association members, and also to serve as a strategic partner to the Covenant to insist the wider denomination on living into being a multi-ethnic and diverse body, impacting the world for Christ. One thing to know about us is, I think the acronyms are kind of hard and they keep changing, right? You have Asian American, you have Asian North American, because we have Covenant pastors in Canada. We also have people part of CAPA who are global, who are not in the United States. We also include Pacific Islanders, and there's various acronyms, AAPI, NPI. We're going to incorporate all of them when we say, and bring them in as family, when we say Covenant Asian Pastors Association. I was thinking about this morning how the Covenant began as a church of immigrants, and thank you, Dr. Hauna, just talking about that and pointing that out. We, family here, we have immigrant roots. We were born out of an immigrant experience. This was the context in which we navigated and brought attention to the needs of the immigrant community. And the Covenant was doing this as they were being considered other and not one of us here in the States, or unwelcome foreigners. And as CAPA members, we understand that, how we can resonate. And as we learn about the Covenant history, we really feel that even today in 2021. If you look at kind of the makeup of the Asian North Americans here, 75% of them in the US, I'll speak of because these are US stats, are immigrants or children of immigrants. And over the past 2 years, we've definitely lived into kind of the status, and not because we want to, but that we don't belong. It doesn't matter if we've been here 5 generations, we are perpetually not really American, but we identify as American, and that's part of our story, is the American story. We're also not a monolith. I feel like I need to say that. because you may think of Asian and just have one face in mind, but if you actually Google Asian American, the number of faces and images that come up will surprise you with such distinct features and culture and history and experience, languages, divergent experiences across class lines and educational attainment. So I think I just wanted to point that out and let you know that it's not a monolith when you think about Kappa or the Covenant Asian Pastors Association. In terms of history, Hauna touched on it. The first Korean ECC church was 1969. There were three actually: the Korean Covenant Church in San Francisco, the Korean Evangelical Covenant Church in Chicago, and the Korean Central Covenant Church in Northbrook. So there was a Korean Ministers Association of sorts, and then there was Covenant Asian Pastors Association of sorts, and they've been separate entities. And, you know, I can talk more about that later, but I think the way that historically we've been woven into the covenant denomination, there's nothing necessarily written. At every Kappa pastor retreat we have, the oral history is always told. We always tell our story to each other. And in terms of incorporating it, I mean, I can talk a little bit more about that later, but we want to put it down on paper. We want a book. We want a recording of it in one central place. And so there are things in the works for that, and I'll talk about it a little bit more later. Let me just close with key points of belonging and barriers. I am grateful when people in my covenant family take time to ask and learn about our story. We find insight when we're on site with each other. You know, I find it here in these spaces. I find it when we are talking about some of the issues that are affecting Kappa and the Asian community, as we've lived through the past 2 years of being reminded that, you know, we don't belong or we should go back to our country. I find it in spaces with the other ethnic association presidents and the solidarity lived out, where we stand in the gap for each other and will speak up and refuse to stay silent in the face of injustice. And that even when it gets hard, we're not going to leave. The barriers is, you know, I read a recent news report saying that anti-Asian hate has not slowed down. You know, they're doing a story out in the Bay Area where Asian elderly were attacked and some killed simply for being Asian, and it really hasn't slowed down. Barriers are silence, accepting the status quo, maybe not knowing the history, not knowing the story. Barriers are not taking the time to unlearn and relearn. Other barriers, noticing our internalized racial beliefs about ourselves, about others, noticing our interpersonal racism, like whether it's covert racism like tokenism or overt racism like slurs and comments. I think purposeful narrative is what we're going to live into, what our covenant story is now. How does our purposeful living now become our purposeful narrative for tomorrow? And if we are in any sort of leadership in the covenant, how does changing our budgets and resources reflect our values in having a purposeful narrative now? I think about Sankova. We must look back, the journey that LMDJ puts forth. We must look back in our history so we can see and move faithfully forward in what's to come as we seek the coming kingdom of the multi-ethnic Mosaic family, that which we're all part. And as we pursue this true family together. And one last plug, next March, Sankofa, they're doing another journey. So if you're covenant and you haven't been on one, I do encourage you to go. This is part of living into our purposeful narrative and inviting all the voices together to tell one story together.
Thank you so much, Reverend March, for pointing us to the importance of story and some points of connection in the immigrant story, as well as underscoring or cautioning against viewing any story as monolithic, right, within those larger categories that we use. Reverend Murphy?
Yes, thank you, Hauna. Wonderful to be with you all. Was really blessed by that presentation. You know more about some of my history than I do, so thank you for some of those nuggets of wisdom along the way. Um, I want to speak for just a few moments. Let me first kind of draw a picture for AMA. I would say we represent, similar to Kappa, same purpose, same mission, same desire to be partners in helping us live into our true identity as kingdom people. I believe there's roughly about 60 or so African American led congregations currently, depending on church planning survival numbers. That number may have shifted a bit. 100 plus credentialed and licensed clergy within our ministerium pool. And so that represents, a good portion. I think, still not a majority, but a significant portion of our ministerium life and body together. Our current work now is really trying to reach out to everyone within the African diaspora. As Mary mentioned, we're not a monolith, right? We are represented across pretty much every state in the lower 48, all different socioeconomic classes, rural, urban, resourced, suburban, under-resourced, the whole gamut. And so it's a very diverse gathering of folks. And one of the things we are doing now is really trying to put some emphasis and reaching out to the affiliate staff, to pastoral staff, and to lay leaders within our congregations. And a large part of that is because if AAMA was historically really focused on pastors, which typically meant Black male lead pastors, which excludes a large portion of our African-American women who are not often in lead pastor roles, as well as people in doing gifted ministry and all kinds of ECC affiliated work that we currently are really not very well plugged into. So we're really making an intentional effort to expand the scope. And we've got a little bit of that as you have people who are directly from Africa. You've got people from the Caribbean who don't necessarily align themselves with the African-American experience. So trying to expand that pool of African descent is where kind of our focus is now. As I talk about the key points of belonging and barriers to belonging, I think my overarching statement is that I think it's really important for church people, as you're talking about the African-American experience, to just acknowledge that the reality of the African-American experience in the covenant and in the American church pretty much parallels the story of the trajectory of African Americans in American culture. If it's a struggle in the culture, it's a struggle in the church. The church looks exactly like the same issues and concerns that we see outside the church. And so to kind of narrow the focus, I want to point to the last 50 or so years as the bulk of the story. Again, I really appreciated the timeline Hauna shared. If you all on this call have not taken some time to review what I think is one of the most seminal, important works for me in thinking about this story, in 2019, I think it was volume 2 or 3 of the Covenant Quarterly. Some of our esteemed colleagues on this call, Hauna, Michelle Clifton Soderstrom, Dominique Gilliard, several people wrote a response or a reflection on the 50-year anniversary of the Black Manifesto, which was presented to the denomination in 1969. And I want to use that. If you haven't read that, get a copy. Actually, it's online. I found it online when I was thinking about my comments for today. It is an amazing, insightful view into some of the story that we're talking about. So please check that out. I can't recommend that highly enough, but I want to paint a little bit of a picture. So we're talking about the late 60s, mid-late 60s. You got the Watts riot. You've got the assassination of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. You have the Black Party creation, and you have what is really government execution of Black Party leaders, Black Panther Party leaders. It is a turbulent time. And in response to some of that, a year after Dr. King's assassination, a group shows up challenging white evangelicalism, challenging the church in America that there is inherent systemic racism in the institution, and that real reparations and reconciliation should be the work of kingdom people in making this right. Very challenging, harsh language, militant by most standards. And that is the tone that I think was a seminal point in the history of the ECC, and how we're going to really take this ideal of being one church of these different races and different people and different backgrounds, and making that a manifested part of our ethos and DNA. I won't give you a summary because people on this call can do that much better than I can, but it didn't really go that well. It was received, the delegates were received, it was a cordial conversation, some commitments were made and not followed through. And I'm sure TJ will speak a little bit to that in a moment about our non-follow through of commitments. And so this was a watershed moment. And I think has to be considered one of the foundational trajectories for how the covenant really wants to embody, I believe it was the fourth stage of expansion and inclusion on the timeline. And the word that I will use often is optics versus reality. We have a great optics of engagement and inclusion and a desire to be one, but you got to look under the hood to see, does our money, does our systems, does our processes really say that this is a desire, or we want the poster? And that's the challenge that I think we have to look at. So you've got this trajectory in American culture. You got, the turbulent 60s. And then things seem to kind of get better. They seem to kind of settle down. And then you have another flare-up moment. The Rodney King riots in 1992 flares back up, and race is again a national concern. And then things kind of settle down after that. And then Barack Obama gets elected in 2009, and we're all celebrating that we've arrived. And then things go on for a while. And then a few summers ago, there's just a pandemic of executions and community policing issues that raise up, that fosters the Black Lives Matter movement. As you see these ups and downs, I would encourage us to look at those moments as the moments of belonging and barriers that we experience in our own denomination. So I want to frame this in terms of 4 ages. In the 60s, I would say that the covenant was experiencing an age of recognition. The 2 people that I am most familiar with are Pastors Mosby out of New York, Fellowship Covenant, and Pastor Jimison in Chicago. And the stories I've heard about their first attempts to engage and be part of this body, we saw some of the photos of the early pioneers. This was the pioneering stage. And so they are officially on the roster. They are officially part of the denomination. They are coming to annual meetings. And I've heard the stories where their input was minimized. They were, that kind of pet dog that you have in the corner that you let sleep in the house, but he can't walk in most of the house. He's confined to one room. I've heard those stories about the marginalization and the exclusion that they felt in their early years as they were trying to be persistent to their inclusion and participation in the ECC body, but met incredible resistance. To the point that one of the stories, I don't know if we've heard about, but Oakdale Covenant, when Pastor Jimison, when that whole transaction was happening, I've heard the stories that other churches, covenant churches, bought the property so that would not become an African-American led church in their area. This is not subversive. This is overt racism and resistance to this path that we say that we are on and desire to be on. And so that goes on again in the turbulent 60s and 70s. Late 70s, 80s, I'm going to call that the age of inclusion. We saw the resolution on diversity. We saw that there's some intentionality, there's some awareness. Moving through the 80s and into the early 90s, the associations begin to form, and there's some clustering and realization that we have to be intentional about these efforts. I think that age kind of culminates with the 5-fold test. And for multi-ethnic ministry, I should give it the whole name, the 5-fold test for multi-ethnic ministry, which determines that this isn't just a desire, but we will put things in place to make this part of how we actually live in to this desire, not to be a family of ethnic ministry, but to be, or with multi-ethnic ministry, but a family of multi-ethnicities. So I think, again, huge watershed moment as there's real intentionality around this. And then I want to kind of overlay the 80s, 90s, and even up to present day with kind of a broad age that I'm going to call the age of Black exceptionalism. This is where we get the Barack Obama syndrome, right? That one guy made it. It proves that we don't have the issues anymore. We have one rock star. We have one wealthy person. We have one professor. Oops. We have one person who has accomplished whatever the holy grail was, and all of a sudden we have arrived, and we really need to unpack these issues anymore. And the problem is that the age of exceptionalism serves as a mask to the underpinning systems that still oppress the vast majority of people, keeping them out of the conversations. And even when they're at the table, kind of a second-class citizenship. And so I want to kind of wrap up by saying the age I think we are in now and moving forward, and I hope is really what we're manifesting, what we've been talking about for decades, is this age of racial progress. The age where we are really breaking through the barriers and the linguistics and the optics of the past, and seeing real transformation in our desire to have everyone have an equal seat at the table. I like stand-up comedy. God is still working with me. And one of my favorites is Chris Rock. And Chris Rock says two things that I always go back to. He says, being Black in America is like having an uncle who paid your way through college but molested you. It's a bit of a tense relationship that many African Americans have as citizens of the culture, and we feel the same way oftentimes in the church, even in the denomination. And so I think the question that we have to wrestle with is, what does real, true inclusion look like now? What does it really mean? And we've talked about the fivefold test and the sixfold test. What does it really mean to unpack participation and power and narrative, where my narrative is not a second-class citizen to the Swedish narrative? Professor, I always say his name wrong, Sung Ran Cha. Yes. Sorry, I botched his name every time. I'm so thankful for him, though. He was one of the first workshops I went to at a midwinter, and he made this image of the multiple streams. The ethnicities have multiple streams flowing into a river. And once we get all of those stories fully validated, fully acknowledged, fully considered as equal participants, then we get a purposeful narrative of the multiple streams, and we're much richer than we were having a primary stream and subsequent tributaries feeding into it. My thought that I want to share about where we are now and how we go forward really gets to this question of, what does it mean to have multiple voices with equal say? And who's doing the talking? The other thing I love from Chris Rock is he talks about, we have to stop talking about racial progress as Black progress. What I'm excited about in this age is that that it's our allies, our main culture allies, who are leading the cause. You look at a Black Lives Matter demonstration and count the makeup of the ethnic makeup. There is as many white main culture of people, probably more than there are ethnicities. And to me, that's a huge change in what I've ever seen before. That needs to happen inside the church. I was so pleased and blessed about the anti-racism resolution that was not led by quote unquote minority people. It's that conversation of the people who are most connected to the systems of power, deconstructing those and inviting other people in. And we can't do that on our own. I think the age of us leading that conversation is at an end, and it's time for those who are woven into the seats of power and woven into the systems to deconstruct those from the inside out. I'm probably over my time. I could say more, but thank you for a few minutes.
Thank you so much, Bryan. That was really helpful. I'll invite Pastor Nesta to share with us now.
Hi, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone. I think Bryan said it all. I could just close up my time and just insert Latino in there, but I'm going to give a little information, if you will, about our constituencies. So I am the president of ALIPE, the Association for Latino Pastors, in Latino and Latina pastors in the ECC. We recently went through a name change. We used to be called MIPE, Ministerios, a ministry of Hispanic ministries in the ECC. And as an association, we thought it needed to be important for us to be known as an association, as our counterparts, and also get away from the term Hispanic, as it is a term that was kind of put on us, and we didn't accept it. Latino is much more encompassing of all of us that make up the term Latino, which is Spanish and non-Spanish speaking brothers and sisters. So we are a community that represents a variety of countries, cultures, languages, and nationalities. And we're composed of people identified by their Latino heritage and ethnicity. And so we wanted to make sure that it is understood and that we are celebrated. So I invite you, as we still have a lot of literature and a lot of things that use the term Hispanic, that we get away from that. And not Hispanic, not Latinx, but Latino, Latina, which is what we are engaging with, and what we are saying is our how we identify ourselves. So our situation is a little different. We are part of the ECC, and then we also have an international component called CIPE, the International Covenant Churches in Latin America. And so this position really is trying to engage the Latin American ECC churches and try to have all of us feel like we're a part of the family, part of the community. And it's interesting because of our language barriers. When we talk about barriers, that has been one of the big barriers for us, where we are very much, one thing that I love about our pastors is that Latino pastors, when they are called into the ministry, it doesn't matter whether they're paid necessarily at the same degree as others, but if they are being called, they are serving. And so our covenant pastors, our Latino covenant pastors, especially those serving in a Latino church, Spanish-speaking Latino church, are serving, and they are working, but often, kind of like Bryan said, off to the side, have been, I think, happy to be present, but not always included. And so that is part of the work that we have been doing most recently, to try to have our Latino pastors have a voice, have access to everything. One of the things that we have been, that I have really tried to advocate for is, if we are talking about fully engaging the Mosaic and all of us being part of this family, but then, we don't have equal access to everything because of the language barrier, because these same things that are made in English are not available in Spanish to our pastors, then that's a disservice. And it is inequitable. And so that is one of the things that we have been, part of our narrative, part of our story is consistently trying to be not only having a seat at the table, but making sure that we are advocating so that all of us are feeling like our needs are being met. There's some really startling and exciting statistics that by 2045, we're going to be a nation of minorities, meaning that the white population is going to be less than 50%. This is by 2045. According to church planning statistics, this could happen even sooner. The white population within the last 10 years has dropped from 69% to 60%. So if this continues, maybe even before 2045, we are going to be at about a 50-50 of non-white churches in comparison to white churches. So the conversations that we're having right now, and this, right, being able to talk about what our narrative looks like is so important, because as these statistics come into play, we need to be able to ready ourselves and prepare ourselves as the ECC to be able to receive that. we have about 100 Latino churches that make up the ECC. That's not international, that's just here in the US, and about 120 clergy, and many of them Spanish speaking only. And, you know, how are we meeting those needs? As we're talking about, you know, what are some of the barriers and what are some of the things that we are experiencing? I'm coming very heavy-hearted today, as just this weekend, we are dealing with a situation where some of our students were invited to a youth retreat, and these students were called dirty Mexicans. We're told that they were going to be deported, and so many other things that are just too vile and hurtful to repeat. And so while we have come a long way and we have seen progress, we still have a lot of work to do as a body, as an ECC body. I wish I could say that this never happened, or I wish I could say that this happened just, you know, 20, 30 years ago, but this was 4 days ago. That our students are still dealing with these types of things, that our adults are still dealing with these types of things. And so I wish that we could say that these types of racial tensions don't happen in the church. But I'm sad to report that these students, prior to going to this youth retreat, had never experienced a racial experience like that. They had never been called dirty Mexicans until they went to a Christian, one of our Christian retreats. And so, yes, I am grateful for what the ECC is doing, and I am grateful that we are moving towards a full Mosaic. But I do know that we have a long way to go. And I'm sorry to end on that very unfortunate note.
No, thank you so much, Pastor Nesta, for your vulnerability and honesty and bringing that to our attention. Right, we're not just looking back at history, but this is the reality today. So thank you for sharing that. And yeah, there's a lot of more work to be done, and part of that has to do with how we narrate and know our history. Thank you. Our final panelist is TJ Smith, Pastor Smith. So are you still here?
Yeah, I'm good.
Oh, there you go. Okay. Pass it over to you.
Ihane washte matakiape, TJ Smith manchepi malakota, machoke chie denaina. Hi, my relatives. It really means Hihani Washte in the new language means good morning, because it's still morning. I live in Alaska. And in the old language, I like it better. It means may you have a blessed morning. So I like that much better. But Takiape means we see everybody as family in our language and our cultures across the board. And then the Machochie means land acknowledgement. The place that I live on is a land of the Dena'ina people. And so that's really important for us to know the people of the land that we are on. So I'm honored to be here, and thank you for hearing our story. I was on a Zoom just a couple of days ago, and a person who had been around me, someone asked a question and they started laughing. I said, oh, he's been around me because he knows he's going to hear a story. So purposeful narrative is great for us culturally, because Bryan's laughing now because like, yep, DJ's on his story roll. It's part of our culture. We tell story. Again, we're oral tradition, right? So we tell story. And I represent those First Nations people of Alaska, Canada, the US, and Pacific Islanders. It's always important that we name Canada, because too often our sisters and brothers in Canada are, the joke that we have is they're the upstairs neighbors that hear the downstairs disruptions. And so it's one of those things. As you hear me speak, you're also going to hear me use the phrase us and we, meaning Indigenous people. I am using humor because that is part of my culture. I will not make fun of you unless you're one of the 3 EAPs with me, because they're family. So anybody, it's only family ourselves that we make fun of. So they're all laughing because they're like, yeah, we know. A majority of our people are either bivocational or all voluntary in ministry. Originally, when we changed our name, and I'll get to that in a second, we were going to call it IPA, but we thought with Indigenous people that wouldn't necessarily be appropriate. So we changed to IMA. I appreciate some of you laughed and caught that joke. That's good. If not, check with me later. So a lot of our people are doing ministry, but not vocationally. And if they are, they're doing it bivocationally. There's a small handful of us that vocationally, this is our call. And again, that's part of our culture. It's part of our people. It's also part of our story. In our story, it's important to know that we've always been part of the ECC. Because as you heard, in 1889, the Swedish missionaries came to, there he is, Curtis, to his village and community, in Unalakleet, and shared. But for us to have a voice, is Bryan, what I think was talking about, the other 6 Ps, for us to have a voice, it wasn't until my other 3 Ps, ethnic associations presidents, stepped up and said, hey, they've been at the table, but they have no voice at the table. And that is our story. We've always been, and we still are, invisible. We started off as AMA, Alaska Ministers Association, because of the missionaries coming to Unalakleet, that most of those that were doing ministry were from Alaska. And then we changed to NAIA, which when I stepped in this role, I was like, that's Division 4 basketball. That's not good. We wanted to step up the game a little bit. If you don't understand sports, I apologize. Which meant North American Indigenous Association. And then we changed to IMA. But one of the things that was important for us is standing in solidarity together. As you've heard my sisters and brothers' story, because they stood with us, now we have a voice at the table as of about 2 years ago. It's important to know that on Turtle Island, which is what we call North America, there's over 1,000 nations. In Alaska, we have 20 nations itself. And it's important to know, as Mary said, that each of our nations are uniquely different in our language, in our regalia, in our culture, in our foods, in our traditions. I love Richard Twist. He was a Lakota theologian, and he said, each nation is as unique and distinctive as the Norwegians and the Japanese. And so that's always a barrier we always face, right? Oh, you're Indian, so I know you. I've been, and I've heard this from pastors here in Alaska. Oh, I've been on your reservation, I understand you. I'm like, spending a week doing mission field work on a reservation, you don't get us at all. You don't know us. Because usually they come in with that rescuer mindset. Let me save the poor Indian, which has always been a piece of our story. So those are a couple of things that are important. I think that those barriers and belonging, as I said, we're invisible. We've always been invisible. I share this story not for shame, but because this happened our last gathering at midwinter. My Masoon, my younger brother, and I were sitting together at a church planners meeting, and a pastor was talking about in his community of all the cultures that they'd reached out to, the African American, the Asian culture, the Latino culture. He goes, we don't have anyone else we can reach out to. My brother and I look at each other with tears in our eyes and go, he didn't even call us out. It was in Oklahoma in the Trail of Tears, where all of our people, a lot of our people, part of my family was moved to. I'm also Winnebago and Cherokee on my grandmother's side. we weren't even recognized. That this is where we got forced to. It wasn't optional. Please hear my heart. I speak out of my heart. So please don't interpret out of your imagery or your story, but listen to my story. We know the story of Gabby Petito. She should have never have died. It's a terrible, terrible loss. But my heart always breaks because where her body was found, 710 of my sisters were found in a 10-year period. And I never saw one on the national news. 30% of those were covered in the local news. That's it. We're always invisible. As I shared, we had no voice. The previous presidents of our association were at the table, but had no voice. I'm thankful to have a voice to share our story. Again, one of the things about us is please don't buy the narrative of media and movies. You ever watch an old John Wayne movie and you see the Indian is just a dumb, dirty Indian, right? But that's not reality. We just have a different cultural standard. I was reading a comment by Oyese, which is Charles Eastman is his name. He's Dakota. And he talks about that as younger children, they're taught in our culture to not possess just a simple thing, because that will absorb you and consume you, but learn to give that away so you see the community, not the individual thing. That is our culture. That is who we are. And across the board, and in our cultures, we see that. You get a group of natives together, and we had our first dinner 2 years ago as an association, and we spent 3.5 hours sitting and talking, telling story, laughing, and walking away going, oh my gosh, that's my story. And we could insert. A couple years ago, it was a Hawaiian and a Nupiaq and me and a Tulalip and a Western brother. And we were sitting there, and he was like, you all are finishing each other's stories. We're like, yep, because it's all the same story. One of the things, my hope and prayer is you hear our hearts, you hear our stories. We bring so much to the body of Christ. Curtis Ivanoff, who is on here, and I, 2 years ago at Midwinter, sister and brother are planning on her nation's lands a church, the first church plant on a reservation, and she's going back home. So we asked, can we come and pray in our languages? His language is Inupiaq and mine is Lakota. And the pastor and his wife, her language is Chippewa, Ojibwe. And as we prayed, we were told later on that was life transformational because our languages were accepted in the ECC, that we are a part. That to me is that barrier to be able to be seen, to be able to overcome. As you've heard my sisters and brothers' stories, they're all interchangeable. We can all just swap out our stories. And that's one of the things that I love about them, especially, is because we listen and learn from each other's stories. We don't assume we know, but we ask those hard questions. We've built the relationship to ask those hard questions and tell me to unpack. As Juana shared her story of hurt and pain, we all were so sorry, we'll send the 2 enforcers down, let us know. As Mary has been called names with her children in Target in Minneapolis, how can we stand? When George Floyd was killed, we all reached out to Bryan to check in, because that's what we're supposed to be. Mataki ape, mataki oyasi. We're all related. We're all family. And the more we hear each other's stories at our hearts and not through our own perspectives, the more we will be. I was on a Zoom last week, and the person was sharing about Pigpen from Snoopy, Charlie Brown, yeah? And you think about Pigpen. Everywhere Pigpen goes, what goes with him? The dirt, the dust bowl. And so knowing the dirt and the dust bowl that we bring into the conversations, our perspectives, that becomes a barrier in itself to hear our stories from our hearts. Pilime, thank you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Smith. And as we think about those stories and the P of purposeful narrative within the fivefold and now sixfold test, in order to move beyond simply invoking purposeful narrative to really enacting that through the integration of those streams that Bryan described, referencing Soong-Chan's work. I'd like to ask the panelists as a final briefer question, after which we'll turn it over to Dave Bjorland and some general Q&A, for just a brief response reflecting on purposeful narrative within the covenant, and to share a little bit about what work has been done or is being done to tell the particular story of your covenant community. Right? You're part of the covenant mosaic, and what work remains to be done. So let's just go in reverse order. I'll throw it back to Pastor TJ, and then we can just go in succession and then turn it over to Dave.
Pilime, thank you. I think a lot of people automatically assume an Indigenous perspective, well, what can I do? We heard that a lot after the repudiation of Doctrine and Discovery at Gather 2021. And I'll talk about that in a second. But one of the things you can do is ask the question, whose land are you on? In the beginning, I acknowledged the land of the Nanaina people. That's whose land I have stewardship of. They took stewardship of it. You can go to Genesis chapter 2. Adam and Eve were given stewardship of the land, the garden. So just to acknowledge, there's free apps for Canada, for the US, for Alaska that tell you the land that it's on. For us as Indigenous people, in Canada and the US, there were 850 treaties written by the governments. Not one treaty has ever been kept. So for us, words mean nothing. I don't care about your words. I care about your heart and your actions. So for us, one of the things that we are looking forward and we're doing, and my elders have given me the charge to ask our youngers, what are the steps for repudiation of doctrine and discovery that you as youngers want? And again, culturally, that's not the way we are. We always go to our elders. We had a pastors gathering yesterday, and it was like, okay, elders first, because that's our culture. Even as we have blended cultures here, that is our culture. Our elders eat first, then the youngers. But our elders of IMA have said we need to ask our youngers first, because when we walk on, it's theirs to pick up. So what are those things that they see? And one of the things is that I've heard from some of our youngers is to acknowledge us, just to know, to listen, and don't assume. Again, to live out the repudiation of doctrine and discovery. So we're putting those in place. At Midwinter, come and talk with Curtis or I or any of our members, and ask questions of us. If you can find it, it's sold out, which is super exciting to me. But as of August, the whole New Testament is in the First Nations version. And if you read that, you get a whole different perspective of scripture, of life. You see it through our eyes. I remember the first time I was reading it, and I literally had to stop and put it down because I was in tears. Because in the fig tree, it said, and Creator sets us free, took a tomahawk to the tree. Jesus took an axe and cut down the tree. Because in our naming of people, in our new culture, you give an elder $100 and they'll give you a name. But in the old traditional culture, they sit and they watch you for a year, and then they name you after that year by your attributes and your traits and who you are. So as you read the First Nations version, you will see each person or each group of people, they have that. And I love that it was over 30 different nations that came together to have input on this, to do that. Christianity Today next week on the 18th is doing a webinar where it's 5 different Indigenous people coming. And one of those is one of the people that helped write the First Nations version. One of them is one of our ECC sisters, and one of them is Randy Woodley, who is very close with us. My hope is, just as we have Journey to Mosaic, which to me is incredibly powerful journey. I've been able to go on it twice. It was life transformational in Sankofa. My hope and prayer is someday we have a Trail of Tears journey. And one of the pieces I want to do on that Trail of Tears is, regardless what the weather is like, you have to get off the bus and you have to walk for a mile. Just to walk part of the trail, to feel the ground, to think if your loved one died and you're forced to march on. So those are some of the things that I apologize if I didn't answer the question, so you can clarify, but those are some of the things as we look ahead to be able to continue to give opportunity for our people to have a voice in the ECC. And I'm so appreciative that we are gaining that voice. And I love that it's not just me. It's not just our elders, but our youngers are starting to, the Creator made me to be Indigenous, to be able to share our perspective of who God is. And so with that, we are excited to do that and honored to be here. Thank you.
I'll just jump in, Hauna. I could say a lot, but I think, especially given the experience that some of our youth just went to, I think it's important for us to understand that if we are going to be hosting events like retreats and different things that are typically historically white in context, that we have to have people that have cultural competencies to be able to deal with. If we are going to open our doors and be inviting, we can't do it irresponsibly. We have to be able to set up things. People have to be on committees to be able to say, if this happens, then what, or how can we avoid these things, which is why it's so important to have people of color on every network, everything that is being done. It's irresponsible for us to be on this mission and not have people of color speak into it, because we are the ones that know what it feels like to go through these things. So I'm happy to report that with the advocacy that we have been doing for that, and this is not just us here, but years of advocacy, we have just gone through some bylaw changes where we are having association representatives be on some of the boards. We're not at 100%, but we're glad that the ball is moving, that people are listening, and that it's being understood that we need to be represented. Again, being able to, I think it was amazing that TJ mentioned Journey to Mosaic. I think we need to have that. I think we need to have the Sankofas. We need to have Journey to Mosaic, where we're understanding all of our different cultures that we are a part of. Because it's irresponsible to say this is part of my broader family, but I have no idea what they're like or who they are. Dominique Gilliard did an immigration journey, if you will. And because of COVID, it kind of got stopped, but being able to I'll share one quick story, which is another traumatic story for me. But earlier in the month of October, I was invited to be a speaker for a retreat. And the amount of times that I heard people using the word illegals was heartbreaking and gut-wrenching. And I sometimes think people aren't even going to believe the things that I say because they seem unbelievable. Someone told me, is there a lot of violence where you live? No, not really. Well, make a long story short, she said, there's a lot of home invasions that are happening that illegals are doing, and I'm prepared to take care of it. These are Christian people that are talking this way. And it's because they don't understand. They're believing the hearsay of what, they have thought for years, and not understanding that no single person is an illegal. And being able to do something like this immigration journey would be transformational, just as Sankofa is, just as Journey to Mosaic has been for so many. So being able to have experiences like that. And if there are going to be people in leadership that are going to be leading at a time like this, these people need to have some kind of cultural competency. We need to be able to hold people's hands and feet to the fire to say, are you prepared to lead at this moment with these group of people, with what we now call the Mosaic ECC family? So those are some wins that we're able to be on boards and we're being seen little by little. But like I said, we still have a long way to go. And there are simple things. There's low-hanging fruit that we can do to be able to meet some of those needs now.
I'll just add 3 quick thoughts about the narrative going forward. One, I'm hoping to kick off. One, Hauna, please send me your slides. They're amazing, and I'm going to steal them all the time. 2, I'm hoping to supplement that. We've lost a generation of pioneers. I never knew Reverend Mosby and Jemison firsthand. We now have a wave of leaders who served under them, knew them, and not just the 2 of them, but some of the other names that you had and other pioneers. What we have to do quickly is capture the stories of those who knew the pioneers and lived in that second wave. And so I'm really hoping not only just to capture that in writing, but I really want to get a living verbal document going to capture their stories. And then I know a little bit. The wave coming after me knows almost nothing. They are the benefactor of the shoulders that we're standing on. I'm the benefactor of those shoulders. But if we don't understand the story, we're doomed to repeat the history that we don't know. And so to me, that's a really crucial part. Number 2, I think our connections with NPU are critical. NPU is still the primary pipeline for pastors in our denomination. And I think if we don't have processes in which we are in partnership, I'm so grateful for, again, the leadership of Michelle and some of the folks on this call about integrating the 6-fold test. I know there's a history between ECC and North Park lately, but we have got to restore that bridge. It is so crucial in our training and our development of new leaders that these issues and our involvement, as much as we can be partners, would be crucial. I think from faculty to curriculum to board leadership, I think at all levels, there are places where we could help broaden the perspective and become the Mosaic we really want to be. Third one, I think as we figure this out, we have to continue having conversations in the church and in our culture that we don't want a melting pot, we want a gumbo. We're coming together, but we are not minimizing the unique value and culture that we're each bringing to the story, bringing to this delicious dish that we're eating together. And I don't know what that looks like, but I know once this work gets rolling, it often becomes assimilationist. And that's not what we're promoting. We're promoting the unique contributions in concert. So I think that's what we got to figure out.
I got permission from Mary to jump in to follow up on what Bryan mentioned and what has come up in at several points in our conversation today, the importance of particular stories and narratives from pioneering leaders. And so I'm going to send a page of resources and links to everybody who registered as a follow-up, including also some bibliography. But I want, following Bryan's point there, just to draw attention to, do you see the oral history collection there? Yeah, the oral history collection that is being built right now in our archives, in the Covenant Archives and Historical Library, where we have, I think at this point, at least 150 interviews. And there are particular resources both in English and Spanish that the Covenant History Commission has produced in order to facilitate oral history projects by individuals and by congregations. And like Bryan said, it is the case that even since we began this project, that several of those interviewed have passed away. So I would just want to add from the perspective of a working historian, that if we are making a commitment to purposeful narrative, that it's essential that we have a corresponding commitment to the preservation of records, written records, and also oral history narratives. I think it's interesting. Well, I could go off a lot about this, but I won't in the interest of time. But I think it's interesting to note a parallel between the beginning of the Covenant Archives at the 50th anniversary of the Covenant in 1935, and to note that now we're kind of at a 50-year period. Ryan mentioned the pioneering leaders. Pastor Willie Jemison began in 1970 as pastor of Oakdale. So I think that maybe the time is ripe to have a similar initiative, to be proactive in creating a pipeline to the archives and really building the source material that we have that is essential for the telling of history now and moving forward. So I'll just put in that plug, and I'll send further resources to all participants. So thank you, Mary, for letting me interrupt.
No problem. Actually, I was going to highlight that in part of what I was going to share next. So that's fantastic. I want to acknowledge I'm on the land of the Ocheri Shakoan people, and I include them as part of me talking in this narrative and what we're doing here, because they are the ones who cared for the land before us. And I meant to acknowledge them earlier. So what is being done to document, to tell the story? What work remains to be done? There's so much work that remains to be done. And I can tell you that Dr. Hauna has done a fantastic job in all her history and covenant history classes to encourage the students to capture oral histories and interviews and to put it down. And I have been in that archive list a lot, and it's been fantastic. So it's, if you're on a long drive, it's worth, listening to and things like that. I highly encourage you to go there. In terms of Kappa, we have captured the Kappa origin story. There's an interview I did with Superintendent Greg Yee to capture the origin story. Reverend Cap Hampson, she did an infographic of Kappa demographic snapshot from every year from 1965 to 2005. Even just while on this call, I got a chat message from one of the participants who said that she wants to put a page on Kappa's website, just working on the Kappa history line. And I believe she's in your class right now, Dr. Hauna. So this is just all exciting. And I love the energy, and I love the hope we have to be moving into really capturing a purposeful narrative, even if it means like we really lean deeper now. I feel like there's never been, maybe that's not true. Right now, it's needed. We need it. It matters who tells the story. It matters who gets to tell the story. It matters who's at the table when the story is recorded. And I just want to point out, this is not a rewriting of history to obfuscate the truth, but to point to truth, because it's going to incorporate the voices of the people who are there. And so I think the Mosaic Commission, along all the ethnic association presidents here, we want to work to bring the covenant to the sixfold test, a framework we agreed upon and we adopted and said we want to live into, because our future narrative, our future purposeful narrative, depends on what we do now. And so when my brothers and sisters here were talking about some of the 2021 realities that are being felt, lived, experienced, the pain that have affected our brothers and sisters, our Mosaic multi-ethnic brothers and sisters, This is why the four of us, and alongside a lot of other people on this call, are refusing to be silent. Because if we're silent, our silence is an acceptance of how things are now. It's an acceptance of how you and I didn't live into a call to stand in the gap and speak up for each other, for the family of God. And on a personal level, I'm not speaking because I'm trying to prove a point. I'm speaking because I need to answer to my children and my children's children what I did or did not do to correct the narrative and to live into a purposeful narrative now. So I want to highlight, and I just want to affirm the J2M, and the immigration immersion experience in Sankofa, and the future Indigenous Ministers Association partnered with the ECC and all your conferences, immersion journey that we are going to do. And something you can do even in your conferences is to send a quick email or text or something to your superintendent saying, hey, when's the next J2M, Sankofa, anything, and what can I do to help? Lastly, what is being done to record the story? Over the past year and a half, there has been a charge to create a Mosaic history book to kind of tell the story of the history of the fivefold test, to capture the teaching of it, how it came to pass, the ethnic associations, and what has happened in the past 3-4 years. And there's like a general understanding, but not all in one place. And this is something that I have taken onto my plate to do. And it is going to come to pass with the caveat that the past 2 years, like many of you, if it's taught me anything, it's taught me that life doesn't always go as planned. And the season that we've been in, it has done a number to all of us, whether it's mentally, physically, spiritually, and psychologically. I've learned to work while wounded is not meant to be a constant state of operation or being. And so the scope of a large Mosaic book that would capture all of these things is going to be more of a primer that is set to come out at midwinter at the end of January. And I am trusting that the limitations I have as a human, though hard to accept, are a gift to me in this season and not a curse. And so I also want to name that it's important to not do this poorly. It's important to do it right. So there will be a primer of sort kind of capturing all of this that will come out at midwinter. But Lord willing, there'll be a full-fledged history book somewhere down the line.
Well, we, as is wont in these types of conversations when they're so good, we don't have a ton of time for questions and answer. In fact, none. We clearly need a second one of these sessions. Obviously, there's so much to talk about and such rich conversation. And I speak for not only my field, the history and theology field, but for the seminary and for the covenant, in thanking you for your stories, for sharing, for your vulnerability, for your joys and pains. And those are gifts to us that as we try to be the true body of Christ that Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 12. Again, I just want to replug oral history as a liturgical historian. That's something we can all do, right? It's not just something we can look for, but you can, if you know someone in the covenant that stories need to be told, all you need very little technology now that's not on your phone. So I'm sure Dr. Hauna would love to hear from you if you have people in mind and you would want to do that, because we're all part of creating this purposeful narrative. And if you do have questions or follow-up, I would invite you to reach out to those in our session today, including any of the seminary folks, and we would be happy to answer those. And maybe we can have another time where we can tell these questions. But it seems particularly appropriate to end in prayer. So would you pray with me? God, whose story is one that is always moving from creation to redemption to perfection, who is taking what has been damaged and making it whole. We confess the ways in which our church has been a part of damaging people of color in our communities and in our nation. And we also give thanks for their stories. We give thanks for stories that remind us of what our community truly looks like, where we all belong to one another. We thank you today for these 4 presenters, for the communities they represent in their rich diversity. We give you thanks for their vulnerabilities, for their struggles and pains that they are willing to share so that we may be transformed. And we give you thanks for these stories that we got to hear today that are part of this purposeful narrative. We pray that your Spirit would empower each of us to see how we can be a part of telling a purposeful narrative that brings all of your children into this beautiful mosaic that is the Covenant Church, that is a small part of that beautiful mosaic that is the body of Christ in the kingdom of God. And so we pray as each of us go from this place, you will give us a task to do, not of shame and guilt, but of joy and of telling that beautiful story. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen.
Thank you all so much for coming, and a special thank you to our panelists, Reverends Mary, Bryan, Juana, and TJ, and Dr. Hauna for leading us in the discussion. Also, thank you to the Theology History Field, Best Field, for organizing this event and kicking us off this year, and Reverend Palmerly for running tech. And a reminder, this will be recorded and put up on the North Park Seminary Facebook page, so it's accessible to those who were not able to be here, so spread the word. And finally, join us in the spring for 2 more lectures. February 23rd will be led by the ministry field, and our own Professor Michelle Dodson's work will be featured on multi-ethnic churches. And then March 23rd will be the Bible field, topic TBD. Thank you all.